Good morning, boys and girls of Riverbank Unified. I'm going to change it up a little bit today, and I'm going to read a chapter book. That means that those of you who are listening may have to spend some time imagining the pictures in your head of what the story is telling. The characters in this book, this is Charlotte's Web. It's by E.B. White. It is a classic. And the characters are Fern and her family, and of course Wilbur the pig, and Charlotte the spider. So let me get started and we'll find out this story if you don't already know it. And if you do, it's so enjoyable to hear stories again and again. The first chapter is called Before Breakfast, and you can see there's really not pictures here, but when there are pictures, I'll show you. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as she was setting the table for breakfast. "Out to the hog house," replied Mrs. Arabelle. "Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern, who was only 8 years old. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything, so your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it? Just because it's smaller than the other ones?" Mrs. Arabelle put a pitcher of cream on the table. "Don't yell, Fern," she said. "Your father's right. The pig will probably die anyway." Fern pushed the chair away and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. "Please don't kill it," she sobbed. "It's unfair." Mr. Arabelle stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you will have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself? This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hands. "Fern," said Mr. Arabelle, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? And if I had been born small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arabelle smiled. "Certainly not," looking down at his daughter with love. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," replied Fern, still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I've ever heard of." A queer look came over John Arabelle's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back into the house, and I will bring the runt. And I'll bring the runt to you when I come in. I'll let you start it on a baby bottle, just like how we feed a baby. Then you can see what trouble a pig will be." When Mr. Arabelle returned to the house a half hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee. Smell the coffee. Bacon. Can you smell the bacon? Damp plaster. Wonder what that smells like. And wood smoke from the stove. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arabelle. Mr. Arabelle set the carton down at Fern's place. Then he walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them on a roller towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid of the carton, and there inside, looking up at her, was a newborn baby pig. It was a white one, and the morning light was shining right through its ears, turning them pink. "He's yours," said Mr. Arabelle, "saved from an untimely death. And may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered, "oh, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." She closed the carton carefully. First she kissed her father, then she kissed her mother. She opened the lid again and lifted out the pig and held it against her cheek. At this moment her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10 years old. He was heavily armed with an air rifle in one hand and a wooden dagger in the other. "What's that?" demanded Avery. "What's Fern got?" "She's got a guest for breakfast," said Mrs. Arable. "Wash your hands and face, Avery." "Let's see it," said Avery, sitting down his gun. "You call that miserable thing a pig? That's a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a white rat." "Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery," said his mother. "The school bus will be coming along in a half hour." "Can I have a pig too, Pop?" asked Avery. "No, I only distribute pigs to early risers," said Mr. Arable. "Fern was up at daylight trying to rid the world of injustice, and as a result, she now has a pig. A small one, to be sure, but nevertheless a pig. It just shows what can happen if a person gets out of bed promptly. Now let's eat." But Fern couldn't eat until her pig had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby's nursing bottle and they poured the warm milk into the bottle. And they fitted the cover over the top and handed it to Fern. "Give him his breakfast," she said. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant pig between her knees. Teaching it to suck from the bottle, the pig, although had a tiny but good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked from the road. "Run!" commanded Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a donut into her hand. Avery grabbed his gun and another donut. The children ran to the road and climbed onto the bus, and Fern took no notice of the others in the bus. She just sat and stared out the window, thinking what a blissful world it was and how lucky she was to have an entire pig to be in charge of all by herself. By the time she reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting the most beautiful name she could think of. "Its name is Wilbur," she whispered to herself. She was still thinking about the pig when the teacher said, "Fern, what's the capital of Pennsylvania?" "Wilbur," replied Fern dreamily, and all the children giggled and Fern blushed. And there's the picture of Fern with her baby pig. And that's the end of chapter 1. We'll be